Welcome to a special report from the Kentucky Baptist Convention. Today I'm talking with Brent Leatherwood, who is president of the Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission of the Southern Baptist Convention. And we're going to talk about ERLC's brief to stop the gender transition surgeries for children, as the U.S. Supreme Court recently heard oral arguments in U.S. versus Skrmetti. Brent, let's just jump right in. Can you outline for us the case in Tennessee?
Sure. It's actually pretty straightforward. A few years ago, there was an investigation of a medical clinic here in Nashville, and it was revealed that minor children were coming to this clinic and receiving, these radical transgender therapies, including hormone therapies, as well as physical surgeries. And Tennessee legislators took a look at the activity there and decided to pass a law that would ban that sort of so-called gender-affirming care. The law was challenged, and it pretty quickly made its way up to the U.S. Supreme Court. That typically takes several years, but this law was only passed a year and a half ago. Since then, about 25 other states, including Kentucky, have passed similar laws, and my hope is that after the oral arguments last week, the Supreme Court will uphold that law.
So what were the primary arguments, Brent, on both sides of the case?
So the U.S. Solicitor General and an attorney for the ACLU, they argued the perspectives of both the federal government and the individuals who are challenging Tennessee's law. Tennessee's Solicitor General argued on behalf of the state of Tennessee. And for the government's arguments, they were trying to suggest that, two things. Tennessee's law should be seen as a sex-based law, so sex-based discrimination, and that because of that, it should receive a higher level of constitutional scrutiny by the court. Right now, the law is, or Tennessee is asking for the law just to be looked at on a rational basis, which is the lower level. The federal government is asking for a higher level of scrutiny. The reason they're doing that is because the government's moves with those laws will tend to fail, and that's what they're aiming for with Tennessee's law. When Tennessee's Solicitor General took the lectern before the justices, he rejected those arguments and said, no, this is actually just about medical use. It is that sort of restriction. And one of the points that I thought was incredibly helpful and illuminating for his underlying point is he used the analogy of morphine. And he said, look, we all know that there are instances where morphine is used. If it is used to end life, well, we would say that is wrong. If it is used to help someone who is in pain because they're recovering from a surgery, well, then we would say that that is appropriate. That's an appropriate use. And he's saying that same sort of thinking applies here for the medicines and the therapies that are utilized in these instances. Tennessee is simply saying that in these instances, they are harmful and they deserve to be prohibited. And so that's the crux of it.
So the Tennessee law does not totally ban so-called gender-affirming care, but it does prevent it from being done to minors. What are the implications for families and for children, Brent?
Well, obviously, as Southern Baptists, I think we could articulate some pretty strong arguments for why it needs to be banned across the board. That's not what states are doing. Instead, they're going after what they think is the kind of an incremental step, if you will, which is to make sure that it is banned for children. Why? Because these therapies and the surgeries in particular, they cause life-altering harmful effects. And it's not just physical effects, it's also deep psychological harm. And I think Tennessee was right because of this investigation, because it centered around children, that this is their first approach at this. I don't know whether anyone is going to propose at some point banning this area completely. Right now, the case before the court centers on children, and I think that is absolutely appropriate. We talk all the time in the work that we do at the ERLC and in partnership with state conventions just like yours, Todd, all the time about the appropriateness of the state intervening to protect children. Just think of it in the context of something like abortion. We think it's absolutely appropriate for the state to weigh in those instances. And so that's the same type of approach that's occurring here.
So part of the argument of those opposing Tennessee's law is that it violates parental rights. Can you talk about that aspect of the case?
Sure. So the court actually decided, for the purposes of this case, not to even open up that area of argument. They said, no, this is about just the law, and we're not going to weigh in on other factors such as parental rights. And look, as Southern Baptists, we believe parental rights are very important, even in instances like where transgender ideology has infiltrated schools. But what we're saying here is that parental rights, even as we think they deserve to be respected and understood, they're not all consuming, and they don't get to determine the outcome for their children. Again, just look over at abortion.
Right.
We don't think that parents have the right to end the life of a preborn child, and the same applies here. There's actually a case back in the 70s. It was decided. It's called Parham versus JR, where the Supreme Court said that parental rights do need to be respected, but they're not ultimate. The state does have specific responsibilities when children are in harm's way. And again, all the studies have shown, the investigations have revealed that the children who are put through these radical therapies, they are harmed in many ways. And so in that sense, it's not just constitutional for a state like Tennessee to weigh in here. It's entirely appropriate to safeguard these children from this kind of harm.
Brent, we're grateful for you and the work of ERLC representing Southern Baptist, and in our case, Kentucky Baptist. In this case,
yeah.
I understood that you were in the courtroom, and if so, any clues from what you saw? I realize it's impossible to read the direction of a Supreme Court case, but any clues from what you saw about what the Supreme Court might do?
I'll tell you, Todd, that's the number one question that I've been asked over the last week. And look, it is, I consider it an immense privilege that I was able to be in the courtroom. That's a rarity. The room itself only holds about 350, 400 folks. And even then, there's only about 50 members of the public who are able to get in high profile cases. And this is very likely, depending on any future cases that the Supreme Court grants oral argument to, this may very well be the highest profile case before the court. And it was packed outside. So I do consider it just an immense privilege that I was able to get in there. And not only because of the importance of the case itself, but because this is a Tennessee law. That's where I call home. And so look, you can never draw a direct line from how oral arguments go to how the case will ultimately turn out, because a lot of the times the justices are using their time to question the counselors before them and really probe their arguments and understand exactly what they're driving at. That said, there's a few things that I can say from actually seeing the justices. Because typically when you're watching on C-SPAN, you don't obviously get to see their body language. You're just hearing the actual oral audio recording. Justice Alito, he came into the courtroom with a point to prove. I think it's very clear he's going to find Tennessee's law constitutional, not only because of what he said, but because of his track record on these issues. Justice Kavanaugh and the Chief Justice were expressing a sense of real judicial humility, if you will. So at various points when they were going back and forth in a dialogue with the U.S. Solicitor General, the Chief Justice at one point, he said, look, we're not doctors up here. We're not medical experts. Why should we take the decision in the direction that you're proposing here and overrule legislatures like Tennessee that are representative of their voters and of the people of Tennessee and the other states. And so that gave me a sense that they're going to be hesitant to overturn this. At the same time, I was very impressed with Justice Barrett. She had some great questions, some very insightful questions. And then one of the things that everybody was talking about as we exited was the silence of Justice Gorsuch. That could be read as silence in terms of just really taking in all the arguments because he's really undecided, or he may be expressing a bit of discomfort because folks may remember he authored the Bostock decision back in 2020, which dealt with hiring practices and folks who identify as transgender. And that was not a good case, not a good result. And so he may be trying to lay low, if you will, because some of the same factors are present here, only this time it deals with minor children and trying to protect them.
Brent, this is such an interesting case because it seems like common sense should prevail, but that's not always the reality. Besides evangelical Christians, folks like ourselves, what other groups would want to see the Tennessee law remain in place?
Sure, there's a whole host of faith-based groups that weighed in on the side of Tennessee and asking that the law be upheld. So, for example, the Catholic bishops, they have a great brief in front of the court. Our friends over at the National Association of Evangelicals, they weighed in asking for Tennessee's law to be upheld. The Mormons filed a brief as well. So there's a good collection of faith-based groups that are coming in here on the side of Tennessee. And there's other groups that I'm sure many Kentucky listeners will be familiar with, such as Alliance Defending Freedom. They have an incredibly strong brief. I mean, look, they're one of the top legal firms in the country, particularly on issues of life and religious liberty. So it should be as no surprise there that their brief does a really good job of articulating the various perspectives that I think the justices should understand and get a full picture of why this is important to folks like us. And then one group in particular that I think not only is meaningful in the fact that they filed a brief, but they actually came up in the oral arguments, and that's the folks known as the detransitioners. These are individuals who either started or maybe completed the transition process and decided to come back and change their mind. And that's important because there was a couple different lines of questioning from Justice Alito and Justice Kavanaugh about them, and really trying to help or elicit a response from the Solicitor General of the United States about how, well, this population seems to cut against some of the arguments that you're making, and how would you have us view them? And in particular, Justice Alito was questioning the attorney from the ACLU because he was getting a sense from what this attorney was saying that this class of this group of individuals should be treated as a class, that they have some immutable characteristics about them that are worthy of special protection. And so he was really insightful with the way that he was articulating some of the things that they put in their brief. And both the Solicitor General and the attorney for the ACLU really didn't want to spend much time talking about this population of people. They didn't go so far as to say, well, they definitely need to be a protected class, because Alito understands that the fact that people are changing, that they might even identify as gender fluid, obviously that undermines completely the argument that this is somehow an immutable characteristic, such as skin color or sex, as we rightly understand it as Southern Baptists. So that was a part of the oral argument that was very compelling, certainly for those of us in the courtroom.
Brent, was there anyone from the medical community that spoke or that filed a brief or had a view?
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, there were folks in the medical community on both sides.
Okay.
And I think obviously I lean more towards the ones that were on the side of Tennessee and asking for this law to be upheld, because they see firsthand the ways that these radical and experimental treatments in many cases, the effects that they have on the human body and on the psychology of children.
Brent, if Tennessee's law was to be overturned, what's the potential impact on women's sports and women's private spaces?
Yeah, so it will depend a little bit on how the court does it. If they do move to a heightened level of scrutiny, they overturn this law, it does make me concerned about other areas of the law that talk about there are certain spaces where only females and only males can go, including public restrooms, or as you're talking about here, athletics, and that was hinted at various points in the oral argument, that to overturn this and to apply what the federal government was articulating, it could really open a Pandora's box. I don't think that the justices, or a majority of them, will go that route, but it will have downstream effects for sure in areas that have nothing to do with clinics and experimental treatments, and that's something that obviously we're paying quite a bit of attention to.
We understand there were rallies outside the Supreme Court building supporting both sides of the issue. What did you observe there?
Yes, there were some rallies for sure. Thankfully, I was inside, so I didn't get to see most of it. I had several of our colleagues out there. Look, this tends to happen when you have these high-profile cases, and the stakes are high. Representatives from both sides will stir up these public demonstrations outside the court. Honestly, you're so far back in the court, you really can't hear them, but you could just tell there's a bit of a buzz in the air. I was talking with one of the members of the police force that protects the Supreme Court. They say, yeah, this is a little bit busier day than we thought it might be coming into the term. But there were rallies, people out there largely being respectful of each other, but just advocating for their side. I did think it was interesting at one point, on the side of conservatives, on the side that want Tennessee's law to be upheld, they played Rocky Top at one point, and so obviously that made me, as a Tennessean, pretty happy. I don't know if it does the same for you, Todd, but maybe on that day we were all Tennessee fans.
We love our Tennessee cousins and their music. Brent, this case reflects a growing debate in our culture about transgender rights and identity. How do you think laws like Tennessee's will influence the broader cultural understanding of gender? It just seems like as a culture we do something and then there's maybe a shift back the other way and try to think through these matters. How do you see this law impacting how our culture views this whole gender issue?
Well, I would say take a step back from the law and look. Take a broader view of some of the developments that we've seen across the country. I think I mentioned this at the top. Tennessee is now one of 26 states, beginning in January, one of 26 states where this type of legislation or similar legislation that if not prohibiting, regulating very closely these sorts of radical interventions are going to be in effect. And so 26 states, that means a majority of the country now is saying, hey, this goes too far. And we think as legislators, as lawmakers, that the state needs to step in here. Many of us saw in this most recent election the ways that Vice President Harris's radical viewpoints on taxpayer funding for transgender surgeries to be paid for on inmates who are illegal immigrants. So I really think in many ways 2024 can be described almost as a year that the tide turned on this issue, where many of us just kind of woke up to the reality of the harm that comes with this. And look, I don't want to be insensitive. There are definitely families out there with children that are deeply emotionally disaffected about this. But to suggest that the answer to that are these sorts of radical surgeries that have such deep, lasting, harmful effects, that strikes me as just fundamentally flawed. No, what these families need are support. They need folks like us, churches, coming around them and saying, hey, we're going to walk with you through this season. And those children, they do need therapy, but just not this kind of therapy. And so I really think that we've hit a cultural point where more Americans realize this, and that's a good thing, because it's clear that this sort of radical ideology that allows this sort of experimentation on our children, it's gone too far. And so turning the tide on it, that is a unqualified good in our culture right now.
It's amazing the impact the entire LGBTQ plus movement has had, the rapid pace at which that movement has gained influence. Many have said that the T is going to be the sticking point for many. It's this issue right here that a lot of folks just shake their head, and while they have great Christian struggle with all the other, but this feels like a bridge too far. Brent, from a Christian ethical standpoint, what are the primary concerns you have regarding the entire transgender issue?
Well, I think we need to understand exactly what this represents. It represents an extreme departure from God's design for our bodies, as revealed to us in Scripture, Genesis 1:26, 1:27. And ultimately, for the activists, I would submit that this is about idol worship. And the idol that they are fashioning is the idol of self and self-determination, to the point where obviously they are trying to go away from what it is that God designed. And so we need to speak against that, because real lives are being harmed. And that's why we are so supportive of this law. We came out with our state policy agenda that we work on with your fellow state execs, Todd, to look at proposals that are coming about at the state level, and the principles that are behind this law, those are ones that we've supported. And we felt so strongly about this case in particular that it caused us to file a brief, which most folks will realize we do that all the time. It's generally done in the context of a coalition, but for this case, we decided, no, we're going to devote some real resources to this, find a Southern Baptist attorney who can write our brief, and team up with our Tennessee Baptist Convention partners, to put this before the court, because we do think that there are obviously some legal matters, but there's also some deep moral issues at play here. And we think the theological principles that we hold dear as Southern Baptists really deserve to be brought forward in front of the justices. And so that's why we've been so active on this case.
Brent, just kind of as a side note, thinking about the work that you do and that ERLC does, ultimately these matters are only ultimately addressed through the gospel. It's a changed heart through transformative work of Christ in a person's lives. What keeps you encouraged when you're battling against cultural issues that feels like the tide's constantly pushing opposite of a gospel or a Christian worldview direction? How do you stay encouraged?
Well, because we serve a good God, and He calls us, regardless of the context that we may find ourselves in, He calls us to stand on truth and to reveal that truth to our neighbors around us, because we know that the Bible, while it is a framework for their flourishing, it's also an invitation for them to be saved. And so He calls us to that work, and that is something that our team and me, we're just constantly thinking through that with all these policy issues that are very important, and I don't mean to diminish them, particularly
right.
In a case like this, that it's very important. At the end of the day, as we are thinking through the best strategies and the doors of members of Congress or even the justices that we can attract to our side in a case, we always want to make sure that we are ready and willing to share the gospel in whatever conversation we may be involved in, because that's truly the heart of what we do at the ERLC. We want to bring, we mean it, we want to bring the hope of the gospel to the public square. And, we have to understand and see clearly the days are evil. Scripture tells us that. But in the midst of that, we are called to be salt and light. And I'm thankful that this case has worked its way up to the U.S. Supreme Court so we can do just that before our nation's 9 Supreme Court justices.
Brent, I think I hear you saying that we're not saying that there's folks don't have a real struggle here and there's not a real issue they're battling with. We're just taking the posture that this is certainly not the right answer, and a transgender surgery for a child is certainly not. You mentioned Justice Alito. In his questioning of the pro-transgender side, he cited the Cass report as a reason to pump the brakes on transgender procedures for minors. What is the Cass report, and why does it matter in this debate?
So most folks will understand that Europe has gotten in many ways well ahead of where the United States is on transgender ideology. Well, they've gotten so far ahead, they've actually raced backwards from where we are, and they have reined in many of these extreme medical therapies and surgeries that for way too long had been able to just run rampant across Europe. The Cass report is an independent review that was done in the context of the United Kingdom, and it found all sorts of problems with these sorts of experimental therapies, and it found no support that they end up actually having long-term positive effects. And just this week, the United Kingdom made a decision to indefinitely suspend these sorts of therapies, and that follows on the heels of them closing down the one clinic that was in the United Kingdom that was doing these sorts of gender affirming care, and so that's what the Cass report is. And I am hopeful, because it did come up during oral arguments, that the Supreme Court will see the wisdom of the turn that has taken place in the United Kingdom and in Europe, and see that at least a majority of the states want to join them. And my prayer long term is that our nation as a whole will as well.
Brent, one of the arguments that the pro-transgender transition side has often used is the threat of suicide, that a child that doesn't receive the care and attention that they need or that they think they desire, that they may end their life, and that's a reason to allow more of this. Did that issue come up at all, and is there any validity that you know of to that issue?
It did come up a little bit. I don't think that it was persuasive in the courtroom. And look, we would agree in one sense that these children who are facing deep emotional distress, they do need care and need.
Right.
It's the type of care that they are proposing that we are fundamentally opposed to, because it obviously goes against God's design for these children. And I think there are other studies that are more persuasive that talk about so many of these children that might express these sorts of sentiments. Oftentimes, they just age out of it. If you will just allow the puberty process to fully play out. And again, I said this before, I don't want to diminish the fact that there are some children that are wrestling with this, and there are parents that are just, they're crying out for help. And they see these therapies, these clinics as a way to help their child. But that's just not appropriate. It needs to be outlawed, and they need wraparound care that will come around these families to help them through these seasons and these challenges.
I appreciate your sensitivity to those families. Brent, with Republicans soon having control of Congress and the White House, any chances that the Tennessee law could become a federal or get passed at a federal level?
Maybe. Look, it is a Republican trifecta, right? In the sense that Republicans now control the White House, the House, and the Senate. But it's a very slim majority in the House. While the Republicans have the majority in the Senate, it's only 53 votes. So I don't know if in this next legislative session that will happen. I think one might be proposed. But instead, what I do know is that there's a real opportunity to call back some of the executive rules that were passed under the Biden administration that really advanced transgender ideology across whole sections of government. That has been a concern that we've raised. We sent a memo, actually, we shared a memo with the Trump transition team with what I would characterize as kind of easy wins that they could accomplish in their first few days, first 100 days in office. And chief among those proposals was reining back in these executive actions on transgender ideology. So I think there's a real opportunity there. Congress could also use the power of the purse to make sure that no funds can be expended for these sort of radical surgeries. And I think that's a way where we can really advance the ball here. Some sort of national ban, that may be a little bit further off, but that's okay. We can take incremental steps to get there.
Thank you for using your influence toward that end. Last question, Brent, how can Christian communities effectively engage in conversations with transgender issues in a compassionate way without compromising biblical values or showing hostility to those who as you've said, really are struggling? And the family piece, if your child's struggling, then the parents are struggling as well. How can we compassionately engage those families?
You know, it may seem simple, but it's true. Be the hands and feet of Jesus for those families, and then for legislators and lawmakers and policymakers, don't be afraid to engage them on this issue and help them understand the importance of this issue and why it is entirely appropriate and constitutional for the state to intervene when children are in harm's way. And that's really the crux of it. Are you consistent in how you apply that? And I think so many Christians, we are, and we need lawmakers to do the same. There are real lives at risk here. Children have been harmed, and these sorts of radical experimental surgeries and hormone therapies and whatnot, that's not what is called for. And so therefore the state has an affirmative duty to step in and make sure that children are no longer harmed. And so use your voice, be the hands and feet of Jesus for these families, for these children, help them through this season, help them through these challenges, and then use your voice in the public square. And do so in constructive ways. Don't do it in hackish ways, but help people understand from where it is that we are speaking, which is Scripture, and we know that God has set forth His design for our bodies, for our good and for His glory, and our laws should reflect that.
Brent, thank you for using your voice on behalf of our Lord Jesus and speaking for Southern Baptist in the places, all the opportunities that the Lord gives you. The Apostle Paul said, I'm not ashamed of the gospel, for it is the power of God unto salvation to those who believe, the Jew first, also the Gentile. Ultimately, our work is a gospel work. And thank you for leading that way at the ERLC, and thank you for having this conversation today to help Kentucky Baptist.
Yes, sir. Thank you, Todd. I appreciate y'all. Merry Christmas.
You as well.